The year was 329 BC, and beneath the scorching sun of ancient Bactria, a crowd gathered to witness something that would haunt the collective memory of the ancient world for centuries to come. What they were about to see wasn't merely an execution, it was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty, a demonstration of power so savage that even hardened soldiers would turn away in horror. The man at the center of this spectacle had once ruled over vast territories, commanded armies, and lived in unimaginable luxury. Now he stood naked and broken, about to endure one of the most horrifying deaths ever devised by human imagination. His name was Bessus, and his story reveals the terrifying depths of Alexander the Great's capacity for vengeance. But how does a man fall from the heights of power to become the victim of such unspeakable brutality? To understand the true horror of what happened on that dusty hill in Bactria, we need to journey back to where it all began, to a moment of betrayal so shocking that it would trigger a manhunt spanning continents and years. Picture this. It's 336 BC, and a 20-year-old Macedonian prince named Alexander has just secured his grip on power. The Persian Empire, the most dominant force the world has ever known, stretches from the Mediterranean to India. At its heart sits Darius III, the King of Kings, ruler of millions. But Alexander has other plans. With an army of just 35,000 men, he's about to challenge the greatest empire in human history. Now, among the Persian nobility stands a man who will become central to our story. Bessus, full name Artakshatra Bessus, serves as satrap of Bactria, one of the most critical provinces in the Persian realm. This isn't some minor administrative post. As satrap, Bessus governs territories that span across what we now call Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. He commands absolute authority over millions of subjects and controls resources that could fund entire armies. Contemporary sources describe Bessus as an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with the characteristic full beard of Persian aristocracy. His dark eyes betrayed both sharp intelligence and something far more dangerous, unchecked ambition. By the time Alexander launched his invasion, Bessus was a man in his 40s, seasoned by decades of political maneuvering and military command. He had everything a person could want: wealth, power, respect, and security, but Alexander's war machine was unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. Victory after victory followed as the young Macedonian king carved through Persian defenses with terrifying efficiency. At Granicus, at Issus, and finally at the massive battle of Gaugamela, Alexander's forces shattered Persian resistance. Darius, the once mighty king of kings, found himself in the humiliating position of fleeing from an opponent half his age. This is where our story takes its first dark turn. As Darius retreated eastward, abandoning his capitals and treasures, cracks began to appear in the Persian command structure. The sight of their king in constant flight from Alexander created doubt among the Persian nobility. In the ancient world, weakness invited predators, and Darius was beginning to look very weak indeed. For Bessus, watching his sovereign's repeated humiliations wasn't just disappointing, it was an opportunity. By the winter of 331 to 330 BC, he had begun secret discussions with other disillusioned satraps, men like Nabarzanes, the court's chiliarch, and Barzaintes, satrap of Arachosia. These weren't minor nobles. These were some of the most powerful men in the Persian Empire, and they were plotting something unthinkable. Their plan was as audacious as it was treacherous. They would assassinate King Darius and present his head to Alexander as a gesture of submission, hoping to secure their own survival and perhaps even advancement in whatever new order the Macedonian conqueror would establish. It was a calculated gamble that would either save their positions or destroy them completely. The assassination took place along a dusty road near Hekatompelos in 330 BC. Darius, exhausted from months of desperate flight, was resting in his royal carriage when Bessus and his conspirators made their move. According to historical accounts, they first attempted to convince Darius to surrender voluntarily to Alexander. When the king refused, Bessus personally ordered the fatal blow. The great Darius, ruler of the mightiest empire on earth, died not in glorious battle but bleeding in the dirt, stabbed by his own nobles. His last moments were spent cursing the men he had trusted, his final breaths wasted on threats of divine retribution that would never come. But for Bessus, this moment represented triumph. He immediately declared himself the new king of kings, taking the royal title, Artaxerxes V. His first official act was to preserve Darius's severed head in salt and dispatch it to Alexander, along with a message of loyalty and submission. In Bessus's mind, he had solved everyone's problems. He had eliminated the weak king who was losing the war and offered the victorious Alexander a path to easy conquest. This calculation would prove to be the most catastrophic misjudgment in ancient history. When the ornate box containing Darius's head reached Alexander's camp, the young conqueror's reaction was not gratitude, but absolute fury. Far from being pleased by this gesture, Alexander was disgusted. To him, Darius had been a worthy opponent, a legitimate ruler who deserved respect even in defeat. To see him butchered by his own subordinates was an unforgivable insult to the very concept of kingship. Alexander's response was swift and merciless. He ordered the immediate execution of Bessus's envoys and swore a solemn oath that would echo through the ages. He would hunt down the assassin to the ends of the earth, and when he found him, the punishment would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. Darius's remains were given full royal honors, buried with all the dignity befitting a king, while Alexander made it clear that this was no longer just about conquest. This had become personal. From that day forward, Bessus became the most wanted man in the known world. All his hopes of currying favor with the conqueror had evaporated in an instant. Now he was Alexander's most hated enemy, and the Macedonian king would pause entire campaigns to focus on the pursuit. Resources poured into the manhunt as Alexander's network of spies and informants spread across the empire. Realizing his desperate situation, Bessus fled eastward into his native Bactria. The rugged mountains and loyal local tribes offered his best hope of survival. There, he attempted to rally whatever forces remained loyal to him, counting on the difficult terrain to keep Alexander's armies at bay. For a brief moment, it seemed his gamble might pay off. Between 330 and 329 BC, Bessus managed to wage an effective guerrilla campaign against the Macedonians. His forces would strike quickly at isolated units before vanishing into the landscape like ghosts. It was a strategy that had worked for mountain peoples throughout history, and for a time, it seemed Bessus might be able to hold out indefinitely in his rocky fortress. But Alexander's persistence was legendary for good reason. He methodically built a network of informants, offered enormous rewards for information about Bessus's whereabouts, and ruthlessly punished any village or tribe that provided shelter to the fugitive. Slowly but inexorably, the web began to tighten around the desperate satrap. Allies melted away as the pressure mounted, and isolation set in like a creeping disease. The final blow came in 329 BC, delivered not by Alexander's army, but by betrayal from within Bessus's own inner circle. Spitamenes, one of Bessus's last remaining allies, had been watching the situation deteriorate with growing alarm. The rewards Alexander offered were staggering: enough gold to fund a small army, enough land grants to establish entire dynasties. As the noose tightened around Bessus, Spitamenes faced a choice that would define not just his own fate, but the final chapter of this bloody saga. The betrayal came during what should have been a moment of camaraderie. Bessus had called a war council, gathering his remaining supporters for what he hoped would be a final planning session before launching a desperate counterattack against Alexander's forces. The meeting was held in a fortified compound high in the Bactrian mountains, surrounded by men who had sworn loyalty unto death. But loyalty, as Bessus would discover, had a price that even the wealthiest satrap could no longer afford to pay. As wine flowed and strategies were debated, Spitamines made his move. The drug he slipped into Bessus's cup was subtle, a concoction that would leave the victim conscious but helpless, aware of everything happening but unable to resist. Within minutes, Bessus found himself collapsing, his limbs growing heavy, his vision blurring as the men he trusted most began binding his hands with rope. The journey from the mountain stronghold to Alexander's camp was a humiliation in itself. Bessus, once carried on golden litters and surrounded by hundreds of loyal guards, now found himself dragged behind horses like a common criminal. His royal robes were stripped away, replaced with the rough sackcloth of a prisoner. Every mile brought fresh degradation as word spread of his capture. When they finally reached the Macedonian encampment, crowds had already gathered. Soldiers who had spent years hunting this man wanted to see the face of the fugitive who had eluded them for so long. Camp followers and local civilians pressed in, eager to witness history in the making. The air crackled with anticipation as Bessus was hauled before the man whose vengeance he'd been running from for nearly 2 years. Alexander, now 27 and hardened by countless campaigns, studied his prisoner in silence. The young king, who had once been described as beautiful and charismatic, had developed a colder edge. Years of warfare, betrayal, and the burden of ruling a vast empire had carved lines into his face and given his eyes a calculating hardness that even his closest companions found unsettling. Bessus, despite his bonds and degraded condition, attempted to maintain some semblance of dignity. According to witnesses, he lifted his head and tried to speak with the authority he had once commanded. He insisted that killing Darius had been an act of mercy, that he had spared the Persian Empire further humiliation by removing a weak king who could no longer defend his people. The argument fell on deaf ears. Alexander had already decided that this moment would serve as more than simple justice. It would be a lesson carved in flesh and screams, a warning that would echo through every corner of his growing empire. The sentence he pronounced sent shivers through even the most battle-hardened veterans present. Death by live impalement, to be carried out publicly so that all might witness the fate of those who dared betray their rightful kings. Live impalement was not merely execution, it was torture refined to an art form. The method had been perfected by various cultures across the ancient world, but it was the Persians who had elevated it to its most horrifying efficiency. The victim would be positioned on a sharpened wooden stake in such a way that death would be delayed for hours, sometimes days, while consciousness remained intact throughout the ordeal. The psychological impact was as important as the physical punishment. Alexander understood that fear could accomplish what armies sometimes could not. By making Bessus's death as public and horrifying as possible, he would send a message that would travel faster than any messenger across the length and breadth of his empire. Preparations began immediately. A hill overlooking the Macedonian camp was selected for the execution site, chosen specifically because it would be visible for miles around. Carpenters worked through the night crafting the stake, not just any piece of wood, but a carefully measured and sharpened instrument designed to prolong suffering while avoiding immediate death. Word of the impending execution spread like wildfire through the region. Traders altered their routes to witness the spectacle. Tribal leaders brought their retinues to observe this demonstration of Macedonian justice. Local populations abandoned their daily tasks to gather on the surrounding hills. By dawn, thousands had assembled, creating an amphitheater of human spectators surrounding the execution ground. The morning of the execution arrived clear and windless, as if the gods themselves had conspired to ensure nothing would interfere with the grim proceedings. Bessus was brought out before the assembled multitude, his hands still bound, his face bearing the marks of days of imprisonment and interrogation. The man who had once commanded provinces and armies now stood as broken as any common criminal awaiting punishment. Alexander addressed the crowd first, his voice carrying clearly across the silent assembly. He recounted Bessus's crimes in detail: the betrayal of his king, the cowardly murder of Darius, and the misguided attempt to win favor through treachery. He spoke of honor among enemies, of the respect that should exist even between foes, and of the sacred bonds that held civilization together. But it was when Alexander spoke of divine law that his words took on their most chilling tone. He declared that some crimes transcended human justice and required punishment that would satisfy both earthly and heavenly tribunals. The gods themselves, he proclaimed, demanded that treachery be answered with suffering that would serve as eternal warning to future generations. The executioners who stepped forward were not common soldiers, but specialists in their craft. They had been selected for their skill in prolonging life while maximizing pain. Men who understood the delicate balance between torment and preservation that would make this execution truly memorable. The stake itself stood nearly 8 feet tall, its tip honed to surgical sharpness. But this was not the crude, immediately fatal impalement that might end suffering quickly. This was something far more calculated, far more cruel. The wooden point had been precisely shaped to penetrate the body while avoiding vital organs, creating a pathway of agony that could sustain life for extraordinary lengths of time. As the executioners positioned Bessus, the crowd fell into absolute silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the former satrap was lifted toward his fate. The method they employed followed ancient Persian tradition, a bitter irony that was not lost on the assembled observers. The very technique that Bessus's own people had perfected would now claim him as its victim. The initial penetration drew a scream that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the morning air. But this was only the beginning. The executioners worked with practiced precision, ensuring that the stake would support the victim's weight while creating the maximum possible trauma to surrounding tissue. Ropes secured Bessus's limbs to prevent him from attempting to escape his predicament, while his torso remained free to writhe in agony. What followed challenged the endurance of even the most hardened spectators. Hour after hour, Bessus remained conscious, his cries alternating between piercing shrieks and low, animal moans that seemed to emerge from some primal depth of human suffering. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly on the writhing figure, adding the torture of thirst and heat exhaustion to his already unbearable ordeal. Alexander remained at the front of the crowd throughout, his eyes never leaving the dying man. Some witnesses later reported that they saw something troubling in the young king's expression. Not satisfaction at justice served, but a cold fascination with the spectacle of absolute power over human life and death. As the hours dragged on under the relentless sun, something even more disturbing began to unfold. Bessus, despite the unimaginable agony coursing through his body, remained lucid. The executioners had calculated their work with such precision that his mind stayed sharp, even as his flesh was systematically destroyed. This wasn't an accident. It was the most horrifying aspect of the entire punishment. The crowd, initially eager for spectacle, began to shift uncomfortably as the reality of what they were witnessing set in. Hardened soldiers who had seen countless battlefields found themselves turning away. Women covered their children's eyes. Even the camp dogs, normally drawn to any commotion, slunk away with their tails between their legs, as if sensing something fundamentally wrong with the scene before them. But Bessus endured. Through the blazing afternoon heat, his voice grew hoarse from screaming, then fell to desperate whispers, then rose again to inhuman shrieks that seemed to come from somewhere beyond mortal suffering. The stake, positioned with diabolic expertise, had missed every organ that would grant him the mercy of quick death. His heart continued to pump, his lungs continued to draw breath, and his consciousness remained trapped in a body that had become nothing more than an instrument of torment. Contemporary accounts describe moments when Bessus would fall silent for long stretches, his head lolling forward as if death had finally claimed him. The crowd would lean forward, thinking the ordeal was over. Then his eyes would snap open, and fresh screams would tear through the air as some new wave of agony crashed over him. Each time this happened, a collective shudder ran through the assembled thousands, as if they were witnessing something that violated the natural order itself. Alexander's presence throughout this marathon of suffering sent its own chilling message. The young conqueror stood motionless, his face betraying no emotion as hours passed. Advisors approached him periodically, perhaps hoping he would show mercy or at least withdraw from the gruesome display. But Alexander remained fixed in place, as immovable as a statue, watching every moment of his enemy's destruction with the focused intensity of a scholar studying a particularly fascinating text. As evening approached, torches were lit around the execution site. Alexander had made it clear that this would not end with sunset. The punishment would continue until nature itself brought conclusion. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across Bessus's writhing form, creating a hellish tableau that burned itself into the memory of every witness present. The psychological impact on the crowd was becoming as significant as the physical torture being inflicted on the victim. Observers began to murmur prayers, not for Bessus's soul, but for their own. Many felt they were witnessing something that transcended human justice and entered the realm of divine wrath. The very air seemed to grow heavy with an oppressive weight that pressed down on everyone present. By the second dawn, Bessus's voice had been reduced to a rasping whisper, but still he lived. His body, now racked with fever and infection, had begun to show signs of the systematic breakdown that the executioners had engineered. Blood seeped from wounds that would not heal. His skin had taken on a greyish pallor, and his eyes had sunk deep into his skull. Yet consciousness persisted, trapped in flesh that refused to die. The crowd had thinned somewhat overnight, but thousands remained, drawn by a morbid fascination they couldn't explain. Many brought food and water, settling in for what they realized might be a prolonged vigil. Merchants appeared, selling refreshments to the spectators as if this were some festival rather than an execution. The normalization of such extreme suffering revealed something disturbing about human nature itself. The capacity to it was sanctioned by authority. Alexander, the most horrific cruelty, when become accustomed to Even's own transformation during these long hours, was noted by those close to him. The charismatic young king who had once inspired fierce loyalty through his personal magnetism seemed to be hardening into something colder and more calculating. His closest companions observed that he spoke less, smiled rarely, and regarded even trusted advisors with a new wariness. The execution of Bessus was changing not just the victim, but the man who had ordered it. On the third day, as the sun reached its zenith, something finally shifted in Bessus's condition. The fever that had been building in his system reached a critical point, and his body began to convulse uncontrollably. Blood frothed from his mouth, and his breathing became irregular and labored. The crowd pressed forward, sensing that the end was finally approaching. But even then, death did not come quickly. For another 6 hours, Bessus lingered between life and extinction, his body fighting with desperate tenacity against the inevitable. His final moments were marked by a series of rattling gasps that seemed to echo across the hillside, carrying with them the accumulated agony of 3 days of unimaginable suffering. When silence finally fell, when the writhing ceased and the eyes grew still, a strange quiet settled over the execution ground. No one cheered. The crowd begannered. No one celebrated to disperse slowly, as if awakening from a shared nightmare that had somehow taken place in broad daylight. But Alexander's orders ensured that the horror would not end with Bessus's death. The body was to remain on the stake for 7 full days, visible to all who passed through the region. This wasn't merely about disposing of a corpse. It was about creating a permanent monument to the consequences of betrayal. Travelers approaching from miles away would see the grim silhouette against the sky, a warning written in rotting flesh that Alexander's justice was both forgiving. The psychological absolute and unaftermath of the execution rippled outward like waves, nobles who had been contemplated from a stone dropped in still water. Persianating resistance thought twice about their plans. Greek city-states that had been considering rebellion reconsidered their options. The story spread faster than any army could march, carried by merchants, soldiers, and travelers who had witnessed the spectacle firsthand. But the execution also marked a turning point in Alexander himself. Those who had known him before Bessus spoke of a change that went through deeper than mere hard experience. The young king who had once wept at the tomb of Achilles, who had shown mercy to defeated enemies and honored fallen foes, seemed to have discovered something dark within himself during those 3 days of watching a man die by inches. Fed employ in future methods Alexander were campaigns grew progressless. Hisively, more rude treatment of prisoners became harsher. His suspicion of potential traitors, whether enemy or ally, deepened into paranoia. The seeds of the behavior that would eventually alienate his closest companions and contribute to his own mysterious death in Babylon were planted during those blazing days in Bactria, watered by the screams of a man who had gambled everything on a single act of treachery and lost more than the process. The execution site life in itself became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the true nature of power. For years afterward, people would climb the hill where Bessus had died, searching the ground for fragments of the stake or traces of the blood that had soaked into the earth. Some came seeking omens or signs from the gods. Others came simply to stand in the place where they had witnessed the absolute limit of human cruelty, trying to comprehend what they had seen. Local tribes incorporated the story into their oral traditions, passing down detailed accounts of those generation to generation. The tale, 3 terrible days from certain elements remained constant, evolved with each telling, but the precision of the torture, the endurance of the victim, and the cold presence of the king who had orchestrated it all. The execution of Bessus had achieved everything Alexander intended and more. It had eliminated a dangerous enemy, terrified potential rebels across the empire, and established a new standard for the consequences of betrayal. But it had also unleashed something within the conqueror himself that would prove increasingly difficult to control. The young man who had once dreamed of uniting the world under a banner of shared glory had discovered that sometimes the most effective tool of unity was not inspiration, but terror. As the days passed and Bessus's body continued its grim vigil on the hilltop, Alexander's army prepared to move deeper into Central Asia. New conquests awaited, new enemies would fall, and new demonstrations of Macedonian power would be required. But none would forget the lesson learned in Bactria, that there were fates worse than death, and that Alexander the Great possessed both the imagination and the will to inflict them on those who dared to cross him. The rotting corpse on the stake served as a constant reminder that in Alexander's empire, loyalty was not just expected, it was the only path to survival. And for those who chose treachery over faithfulness, who gambled on betrayal over honor, the consequences would be measured not in moments of pain, but in days of agony that would echo through history as a warning to all who heard the tale. And so ended one of history's most calculated acts of vengeance, a demonstration of power that transcended mere justice and entered the realm of legend. The man who had once commanded vast territories and armies became a cautionary tale whispered around campfires and marketplaces for generations to come. Bessus's story reveals the terrifying truth about ambition, unchecked by wisdom, and the catastrophic consequences of misjudging one's opponent. His gamble on treachery, born from a desperate desire to survive Alexander's conquest, transformed him from a powerful satrap into history's most infamous victim of live impalement. The very cruelty he thought would save him became the instrument of his destruction. Administered with surgical precision, by the man he had so gravely underestimated. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this tale isn't the brutality of the execution itself. It's what it reveals about the nature of absolute power and the men who wield it. Alexander's 3-day vigil beside the stake, his cold fascination with prolonged suffering, and his transformation from charismatic leader into something far darker, all serve as reminders that even the greatest conquerors in history were, at their core, terrifyingly human. The hill in Bactria where Bessus died has long since returned to dust, but his screams still echo through the corridors of history, carrying with them an eternal warning about the price of betrayal and the lengths to which power will go to maintain itself.